What happens when the person who knows your deepest secrets becomes your deadliest enemy? Julian thought he had everything, a billion-dollar empire and a wife who was his perfect partner. But tonight in their luxury penthouse, Vivian is about to confess a truth that will burn their world to the ground in less than 60 minutes. If you love emotional stories about power betrayal and the secrets we keep, please hit that subscribe button and stay with me for every twist. This is the story of My Wife Confessed Something Terrifying. It's not just about a marriage ending, it's about a hostile takeover of a heart. It all started with a glass of wine and a cold, quiet smile.
The champagne was still cold, its bubbles dancing in crystal flutes that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary. In the quiet sanctuary of their Beverly Hills penthouse, Vivian DuPont looked at her husband Julian with a gaze that held the chill of an incoming Pacific storm. "I need to tell you something," she whispered, the diamond on her finger catching the dim light of the fireplace. It started as a confession of a fleeting mistake, but as the minutes ticked by, the words transformed into a confession of a systematic execution of their life together. By the time the clock on the mantel struck midnight, the man who thought he had everything realized he was standing in a hollow shell of a home. If stories about the thin line between devotion and destruction resonate with your soul, stay with me. This is not just a story of a broken heart. It is a clinical autopsy of a perfect lie. The scent of Joe Malone's oud and bergamot always signaled the end of a long day for Julian St. James. Usually it was a comforting scent, the olfactory signature of his wife Vivian, returning from a gallery opening or a charity board meeting. But tonight, as they stood in the kitchen of their penthouse, a sprawling minimalist masterpiece of glass and Carrara marble, the scent felt suffocating, like a thick fog rolling off the Santa Monica Pier. They had just returned from their 15th anniversary gala at the Sapphire Lounge. Julian's tuxedo jacket lay discarded on a bar stool, his silk tie loosened. He felt a sense of triumph. The board was happy, the expansion into Dubai was a go, and his wife looked like a goddess in vintage Chanel. He poured 2 glasses of a 1982 Petrus, a bottle they had been saving for this exact milestone. "To 15 years," Julian said, his voice rich with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had conquered the world. "And to the next 50. Vivian didn't pick up her glass. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to him, watching the lights of Los Angeles sprawl out like a circuit board. The silence stretched, becoming heavy, then jagged. "Julian," she said, her voice devoid of its usual melodic warmth, "do you remember the night you forgot Leo's 7th birthday because you were in London closing the Richmond deal?" Julian froze the wine bottle mid-air. "Viv, that was years ago. We talked about this. I made it up to him." "You bought him a jet ski he wasn't old enough to use," she countered, finally turning around. Her face was a mask of pale perfection, but her eyes, usually a soft hazel, looked like shards of flint. "You didn't make it up to him. You paid him off, just like you've been paying me off with Cartier bracelets and shares in a company that you value more than our breath." Julian felt a cold prickle of unease at the base of his spine. "What is this? It's our anniversary. If you're upset about the Dubai trip, we can—" "I'm not upset, Julian. I'm finished." She walked toward him, her heels clicking with lethal precision on the stone floor. She stopped just inches away, so close he could smell the expensive wine on her breath and the coldness in her heart. "I need to tell you something. And you need to listen without interrupting, because in exactly 45 minutes, your lawyers are going to receive a file that will change your life." Julian laughed, a nervous, dry sound. "Lawyers, Viv, you're tired. You've had too much to drink." "I haven't touched a drop all night," she said, gesturing to her full glass. "I've been sober for every second I spent in Sebastian Sterling's bed, over the last 6 months, and I was very sober when I signed the proxy forms he gave me last week. The name Sebastian Sterling hit Julian like a physical blow. Sterling was his shadow, his nemesis, the man who had spent a decade trying to dismantle the St. James Empire. The idea of Vivian with him was a grotesque impossibility. "You're lying," Julian whispered, his hand trembling as he set the bottle down. "You hate Sebastian. You called him a pretentious vulture at the Getty Gala." "He is a vulture," Vivian said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But he's a vulture who listens. He's a vulture who was there when you were in Hong Kong, and Paris, and Zurich. And more importantly, Julian, he's a vulture who knows how to read a contract." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive, sliding it across the marble counter toward him. "That terrified feeling you have right now, that's just the beginning. Our marriage ended the moment I realized I was just another asset in your portfolio. And like any smart investor, I decided to divest before the market crashed." Julian looked at the drive, then at his wife. The woman he thought he knew was gone. In her place stood a stranger who had been plotting his downfall while he slept beside her. "Vivian, what have you done?" "I've set us both free, Julian," she said, checking her gold Patek Philippe. "You have 42 minutes left." The digital clock on the oven flickered 11:19 p.m. Every pulse of the red numbers felt like a heartbeat thumping in Julian's ears. He stared at the USB drive on the marble counter as if it were a live grenade. Sebastian Sterling. The name tasted like ash. Julian's mind raced through 1,000 images: Vivian at garden parties, Vivian laughing at his jokes, Vivian sleeping soundly beside him. Had it all been an act, or had the metamorphosis happened so slowly that he, blinded by his own ambition, simply failed to notice the woman becoming a weapon? "Sebastian," Julian finally managed to find his voice, though it sounded thin, stripped of its usual boardroom authority. "Of all the people in this city, you chose the man who has spent 10 years trying to bankrupt my father's legacy." Vivian leaned back against the window, the sprawling lights of Los Angeles framing her like a dark halo. "I didn't choose him for his business ethics, Julian. I chose him because he saw me. When we sat at those endless corporate dinners, you saw a hostess. He saw a strategist. He saw the person who actually wrote your speeches and analyzed your competitors' weaknesses while you were busy taking the credit." She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, the silk of her dress hissing against the floor. "The affair was easy. A few late-night meetings at the Archer Hotel, a few business trips to San Francisco that you never questioned because you were too busy with your own spreadsheets. But the betrayal that took work, that took the kind of focus you used to admire in me." Julian's hand flew to the USB drive, grabbing it and moving toward his laptop in the study. He needed to see. He needed to prove her wrong. His fingers fumbled with the port, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the sweat on his forehead. Files appeared, folders labeled with the names of his shell companies, his private offshore accounts, and the specific codes for the St. James Family Trust. "How did you get these?" he hissed, his eyes scanning a document that shouldn't exist, a leaked memo regarding the Dubai expansion's environmental liabilities. If this went public, the project would be dead in the water. "These are encrypted. Only I have the biometric key." Vivian's voice drifted in from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame, holding her glass of wine, now swirled but untasted. "You really should be more careful with your phone while you're in the shower, Julian. Or perhaps you shouldn't have used our anniversary, the date you supposedly cherish, as your master password for so many years. You made it far too easy for me to be the perfect wife while I was raiding your digital life. As he clicked through the files, the sheer scale of her treason became clear. This wasn't just a scorned woman looking for a divorce settlement. This was a surgical strike. She had documented every gray area of his business dealings, every corner cut, and every minor regulatory bypass he had ever authorized. "You're going to jail for this," Julian said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and genuine terror. "This is corporate espionage. Theft. I'll have the FBI in this penthouse before sunrise." "Will you?" Vivian asked, her tone disturbingly calm. "Go ahead. Call them. Tell them that your wife has proof of the offshore accounts you used to bypass the taxes on the Shanghai acquisition. Tell them about the bribes paid to the inspectors in Miami. I'm sure the FBI will be very interested in the St. James legacy once they see what I've handed over to Sebastian." Julian felt the room tilt. The porcelain mask of his perfect life wasn't just cracked. It was disintegrating into dust. He looked at the woman he had loved for 15 years and saw a stranger with a cold, calculating soul. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She didn't just want a divorce. She wanted to erase him. "You're destroying Leo's future, too," Julian pleaded, grasping at the only leverage he thought he had left. "This company belongs to him one day. How can you do this to your own son?" Vivian's expression shifted for the first time, a flicker of something raw and painful behind the flinty eyes. Leo's future was already destroyed by a father who only knows how to love things he can own. "I'm not destroying his future, Julian. I'm taking him away from your wreckage." The clock shifted. 11:28 p.m. The countdown was no longer a threat. It was a rhythmic execution.
Before we continue, can I just say how chilling this realization is? Julian spent millions on cybersecurity for his hotels, but he left the back door to his entire life wide open for the woman sleeping right next to him. It's a bitter truth, isn't it? Sometimes the person who knows your passwords is more dangerous than your fiercest rival. Do you think Julian was arrogant or just blinded by love?
The red numbers on the oven clock felt like laser sights pointed at Julian's chest. 11:32 p.m. The penthouse, once his fortress of solitude, now felt like a glass cage. He scrambled back to the kitchen, his breath coming in ragged gasps that filled the silent, expensive air. He looked at Vivian, who was now calmly pouring herself a glass of sparkling water, the bubbles hissing with a sound that mimicked his own eroding composure. "You think Sebastian Sterling cares about you?" Julian spat, his voice cracking with a desperate edge. "He's using you, Vivian. Once he has the keys to my board, he'll discard you like a spent match. You're just a means to an end for him." Vivian didn't look up from her glass. "Perhaps. But Sebastian's use for me comes with a seat at the table and a 15% stake in the new holding company. Your love for me came with a jewelry allowance and a standing invitation to be the silent ornament at your side during mergers. I'll take my chances with the vulture I can see over the husband who refused to look at me." Julian lunged for the house phone to call his head of security, but Vivian didn't even flinch. She simply watched him. When he lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone, only a flat, dead silence. "I took the liberty of updating the smart home system this afternoon," she said casually. "The ivory tower is currently on a private network loop. No outgoing calls, no external internet access except for the dedicated line I've authorized. You're effectively off the grid, Julian. Just for an hour. Just long enough for the midnight transfers to finalize." Julian felt a cold sweat break out across his shoulder blades. This was a coup. A perfectly executed domestic coup d'etat. He realized with a jolt of horror that the shadow partner wasn't just Sebastian Sterling, It was every disgruntled employee he'd ever fired, every secretary he'd overlooked, and primarily the woman who knew his every habit, his every password, and his every sin. The Richmond deal. Julian whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical weight. The leaks last month. That was you. You cost us $40 million. I cost you $40 million, she corrected him. But I made sure that $40 million was funneled into a series of short positions held by a company called VD Holdings. My initials, Julian. I didn't even bother to hide it, because I knew you'd never bother to look at anything that didn't have your name on the masthead. She walked over to the marble island and picked up a heavy, cream-colored envelope that he hadn't noticed before. She slid it toward him. Inside was a series of internal bank transfers from St. James Hotels to an offshore account in the Caymans. They were signed with his digital signature, a signature only Vivian had access to for administrative convenience. This is embezzlement, Julian said, his eyes bulging as he looked at the figures. You've bled the company dry from the inside. They'll put you away for life. No, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal silkiness. They'll put us away. Or rather, they'll put the CEO away. Because according to these records, you authorized every single one of these transfers to cover your gambling debts in Macau debts that Sebastian was kind enough to manufacture for you in the digital ledger. Unless, of course, you sign the voluntary resignation and the transfer of voting rights. Julian slumped onto a bar stool, the 1982 Petrus forgotten and warming on the counter. He looked at the woman he had spent 15 years with and saw the architect of his total annihilation. She hadn't just cheated on him. She had replaced his reality with a nightmare of her own design. Why? He asked, his voice a broken whisper. If you wanted the money, if you wanted a divorce, I would have given you millions. Why destroy me? Vivian leaned in her face, inches from his, her scent of oud and bergamot now smelling like a funeral wreath. Because, Julian, you never would have just let me go. You would have fought for every cent, every stick of furniture, and every minute with Leo, not because you loved us, but because you hate losing. I didn't want a settlement. I wanted a victory. The clock flickered. 11:41 p.m. The shadows in the penthouse seemed to grow longer, reaching for him. The air in the study was thin, tasting of old paper, and the metallic tang of Julian's own fear. 11:44 p.m. He lunged toward the heavy mahogany desk, his fingers trembling as he punched the code into the concealed wall safe behind a portrait of his father. This was his last line of defense, the original prenuptial agreement. It was a document so ironclad that 3 of the top law firms in California had called it the Great Wall of St. James. It stated in no uncertain terms that in the event of infidelity or divorce, Vivian would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back and a modest monthly stipend. The heavy steel door of the safe clicked open with a mocking smoothness. Julian reached inside his hand, closing around the familiar blue leather folder. He ripped it open, his eyes frantic, as he searched for the clause that would strip Vivian of her leverage. Section 8.2, Infidelity, Clause 4. Julian muttered, his voice a frantic staccato. But as his eyes hit the page, the words seemed to liquefy and reform into something monstrous. He blinked, shaking his head, but the text remained the same. This wasn't his contract. Or rather, it was his contract, but the signature page, the page he had signed with such arrogance a decade and a half ago, was attached to a different set of terms. You're looking for the morality clause, I assume. Vivian was standing in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the hallway light. She held a small remote, and with a soft click, the motorized blinds of the study began to close, sealing them in a tomb of dark wood and shattered dreams. I replaced that document 3 years ago, Julian. right around the time you decided that our son's school play was less important than a closing dinner for the Tokyo acquisition. You were so busy, so distracted by your own reflection in the glass towers you build, that you didn't even notice when I asked you to sign routine insurance renewals for the house. You signed the amendment without even reading it. Julian stared at the page. The amendment stated that in the event of a strategic restructuring of St. James Hotels, the spouse would be entitled to 50% of all voting shares regardless of the cause of marital dissolution. She hadn't just changed the rules. She had stolen the board before the game even started. "This is fraud, Vivian. A court will throw this out in heartbeat," Julian screamed, slamming the folder onto the desk. "Fraud requires proof," she replied coolly, stepping into the room. "And as you've already seen on that USB drive, the only digital trail of fraud leads directly back to your private server. Every email requesting these changes was sent from your account. Every digital signature was verified by your biometric key. If we go to court, I'll tell them the truth that you gave me these shares as a gift of guilt, a way to buy my silence for your own indiscretions. And given your reputation, Julian, who do you think the judge will believe?" He felt the walls closing in. The paper in his hand felt like lead. He looked at the signature, his signature slanted, and bold, the mark of a man who thought he was untouchable. Now it was the anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. "You've been planning this for years," Julian whispered, the horror finally settling into his bones. "Every kiss, every morning coffee, every I love you. It was all just a step toward this." Vivian walked over to the desk and picked up a silver letter opener, turning it over in her hand. "Not every kiss, Julian. In the beginning, I really did love the man I thought you were. But you traded that man for a title. You stopped being a husband and started being a CEO, so I decided to stop being a wife and start being a shareholder. It's just business, isn't it? That's what you always told me." The clock on the wall chimed the quarter hour. 11:45 p.m. Only 15 minutes remained before the filing went live to the SEC. Julian looked at the phone on his desk, then at the woman he had once called his soulmate. The paper trail led to a dead end, and the only way out was a door she held the key to. The silence of the study was broken by a sound that felt like a serrated blade across Julian's nerves. The upbeat melodic ringtone of Vivian's iPhone. It sat on the mahogany desk, its screen illuminating the dark room with a clinical white glow. The name displayed on the screen wasn't a contact name. It was just a series of numbers that Julian recognized with a sick, visceral dread. He had dialed that number 100 ILWN to bark threats and negotiate hostile terms. It was Sebastian Sterling. "Answer it!" Julian commanded, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and humiliation. "Answer it, and let me tell that vulture exactly where he can bury his proposal." Vivian didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone and swiped the screen, her movements fluid and devoid of guilt. She didn't put the phone to her ear. She pressed the speaker icon and set it back down on the desk between them. "Is it done, Vivian?" Sebastian's voice filled the room. It was a voice Julian had heard in boardrooms for a decade, smooth, arrogant, and possessing the calm of a predator that had already caught its prey. There was an intimacy in the way he said her name, a proprietary warmth that made Julian's stomach churn. "We're in the final stages of the discussion, Sebastian," Vivian replied, her eyes locked on Julian's. "Julian is currently reviewing the terms of his exit." A dry metallic chuckle came through the speaker. "The exit terms, Julian, I hope you're being reasonable. I've already briefed the board on the unfortunate financial irregularities we discovered during our due diligence. They're not looking for a fight. They're looking for a scapegoat. If you sign the transfer now, we can frame it as an early retirement for health reasons. If not, Well, I've always thought Orange County's federal facilities were a bit drab for a man of your tastes. Julian leaned over the desk, his face inches from the phone. You think you've won, Sebastian? You think you can walk into my house, take my wife, and steal my company? I will burn St. James hotels to the ground before I let you sit in my chair. Your chair, Sebastian replied, his tone shifting from amusement to a cold, hard edge. Julian, you haven't owned that chair in months. While you were chasing vanity projects in Dubai, I was buying up the debt your wife was so kind as to restructure. I own your creditors. I own your lead investors. And as for Vivian, you didn't lose her to me. You lost her to your own ego a long time ago. I'm just the man who was smart enough to appreciate the asset you liquidated. The word asset hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Julian looked at Vivian, hoping to see a flicker of resentment at being called an object by her lover, but there was nothing, only a chilling professional agreement. The SEC filing is queued, Julian. Sebastian continued, the sound of a keyboard tapping audible in the background. 12 o'clock a.m. sharp. Once that button is pressed, the narrative is no longer yours to control. You have exactly 8 minutes to sign the digital transfer Vivian has on her tablet. Sign it, and you walk away with your reputation and perhaps enough of a settlement to buy a nice quiet life in Malibu. Refuse, and I'll spend the rest of my life ensuring you never manage so much as a lemonade stand again. I'm hanging up now, Sebastian, Vivian said, her voice soft. He needs a moment to face the reality of his situation. Don't take too long, darling, Sebastian said. I have the champagne waiting at the Sapphire Lounge. The call ended with a soft click, leaving a silence more deafening than the ringing had been. Julian felt the weight of the entire city pressing down on the glass roof of his penthouse. The man who had spent his life winning was finally facing a game where every move led to checkmate. He calls you darling, Julian whispered, the betrayal feeling fresh and raw again. Does he know you've been funneling money to your own holdings too? Does your partner in crime know you're cheating on him before the ink is even dry? He knows I'm a survivor, Julian, Vivian said, picking up her tablet and opening the final document. And in this world, that's the only thing he respects.
Okay, my heart is actually racing right now after that phone call. Hearing his rival call his wife darling wasn't just about the cheating. It was the moment Julian realized he'd been completely replaced in his own life. His empire and his bedroom were taken in one fell swoop. Can a person's ego ever truly recover from a public humiliation like this?
The ticking of the clock seemed to slow down, stretching each second into an eternity of regret. Julian looked at Vivian, and for a moment the boardroom battles and the stolen shares vanished. He saw only the woman he had stood beside at the altar 15 years ago. When did you stop loving me, Viv? He asked, his voice barely a breath. Was it Sebastian? Or was it something else? Vivian didn't answer immediately. She walked to the small mahogany bar in the corner of the study and poured a splash of scotch, Julian's favorite, but she didn't hand it to him. She stared into the amber liquid as if it were a crystal ball showing a past he had chosen to forget. You think this started with a secret meeting at a hotel, Julian? You think I just woke up one day and decided to ruin you? She let out a short, hollow laugh. It was 3 years ago, November 14th. Do you even remember what that day was? Julian searched his mind, panic rising. The opening of the San Francisco flagship. No, she said, her voice turning into a sharp, cold blade. It was the day after my father's funeral. The day I sat in this very room still wearing black and told you I couldn't breathe. I told you I needed us to take a month, just a month, to go to the house in Tuscany and remember who we were before the company swallowed us whole. The memory hit Julian like a physical blow. He remembered her sitting in that chair, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice trembling, and he remembered his response. He had checked his watch. He had talked about the critical window for the Tokyo acquisition. He had told her that grief is a process, but the market doesn't wait. I stayed. Vivian continued, her gaze fixed on him, now burning with a decade of unspoken resentment. I stayed because I thought that if I worked harder, if I became the perfect partner, the perfect strategist, you would eventually look at me and see a human being again. But you didn't. You just gave me more administrative access. You gave me the keys to your kingdom so I could manage your life while you lived in your vanity. She took a slow sip of the scotch, then set the glass down with a definitive click. I didn't meet Sebastian until 6 months after that. He didn't have to seduce me, Julian. He just had to listen. He sat in a cafe in Santa Monica and let me talk for 3 hours without looking at his phone once. That was the price of my soul. 3 hours of attention. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He remembered the Tokyo trip. He remembered the celebratory dinner, the handshakes, the feeling of absolute power. He had come home with a 10-carat diamond necklace for her, thinking he had fixed her sadness with jewelry. He hadn't noticed that she had stopped wearing it after a week. I tried to tell you, she whispered. That night in Tuscany, or what should have been Tuscany, I realized that I was married to a ghost. A man made of press releases and quarterly earnings. So I decided that if I couldn't have a husband, I would have a fortune. I would take the only thing you truly loved, your empire. So this is revenge. Julian's voice was thick with bitterness. 15 years, a son, a life, all burned down because I was a workaholic. You're no better than me, Vivian. You're worse. You used our son as a pawn in your long game. I didn't use Leo. She snapped, her composure finally breaking. I saved him. I saw the way you looked at him, like a successor, not a child. I wasn't going to let you turn him into another version of yourself. Cold, empty, successful but utterly alone. The clock struck 11:51 p.m. The confession was over, leaving only the wreckage of 2 lives that had drifted so far apart they could no longer see the shore. The clock on the wall was no longer ticking. It was hammering. 11:54 p.m. The air in the study felt thick with the smell of expensive scotch and the stench of a dying marriage. Julian stood up, his legs shaking, and moved toward Vivian. He didn't look like the titan of industry who graced the covers of Forbes. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of his own making. You think you've won because you have the papers. Julian's voice rose, cracking with a manic intensity. You can take the hotels, Vivian. You can take the accounts in the Caymans and the seat on the board. But you are not taking Leo. I will hire every lawyer from here to D.C. I will drag your name through every tabloid in the country. I'll make sure the world knows you're a thief and an adulteress. No judge in California will give a son to a woman who plotted a corporate coup while her husband slept. Vivian didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her silhouette framed by the dark mahogany of the library. You still don't get it, do you, Julian? You think the world still works on your rules. You think you can buy the truth. She reached for her phone and tapped a few icons. A live video feed appeared on the screen. It was a grainy night vision shot of a private jet cabin. In one of the plush leather seats, 10-year-old Leo was curled up under a blanket, fast asleep, with a stuffed pilot bear Julian had bought him years ago tucked under his arm. Margot Sinclair, Vivian's most trusted assistant, sat across from him reading a book. Where is he? Julian lunged for the phone, but Vivian stepped back, her eyes cold and unwavering. What have you done with my son? He's at 35,000 feet, Julian. On his way to my sister's estate in Geneva. He thinks he's going on an early surprise vacation. He has his passport, his dual citizenship papers, and a legal guardian who isn't currently under investigation for corporate fraud and money laundering. You kidnapped him, Julian screamed, the sound echoing off the soundproofed walls. I'll have the authorities ground that plane. With what authority? Vivian countered, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. The authorities who are currently receiving an anonymous tip about the offshore accounts you used to fund your Macau debts. By the time that plane lands, you'll be lucky if you're not in a holding cell. I've spent months documenting your neglect, your absences, and the way you've funneled money out of Leo's trust to cover your Dubai overruns. I didn't just take him, Julian. I protected him from the fallout of your collapse. Julian slumped against the desk, the weight of the realization crushing the air from his lungs. He looked at the screen, at the peaceful face of his son, and realized he was looking at a world he no longer belonged to. Vivian had stripped him of his empire, his pride, and now the only human connection that gave his life a semblance of meaning. You're a monster. He breathed, tears finally stinging his eyes. No, she said, sliding the digital tablet toward him one last time. I'm your creation. You taught me that everything has a price. You taught me that in every merger someone has to be liquidated. I just learned the lesson better than you did. She pointed to the signature line on the screen. The document was an all-encompassing surrender. The voting rights, the resignation, the custody agreement. In exchange, the evidence against him would remain unverified, and he would be allowed a generous enough settlement to avoid total ruin. Sign it, Julian. Sign it, and you can at least keep your freedom. Refuse and you lose everything, including the right to ever see Leo again when he turns 18. The clock flickered. 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes. The digital pen felt like 1,000 pounds in his hand. Julian looked at the woman he had loved, the woman who was now his executioner, and realized that the terrifying part of her confession wasn't the affair or the theft. It was the fact that she no longer felt anything for him at all. The digital pen felt colder than ice as Julian's hand moved across the glass screen. It was a fluid, practiced motion, the same signature that had launched hotel chains and changed city skylines. But as the N in Julian trailed off, the tablet emitted a soft, final beep. 11:59 p.m. The document uploaded to an encrypted server, and just like that, the St. James era ended, not with a boardroom coup or a stock market crash, but with a silent pulse of data in a darkened room. Vivian picked up the tablet. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply checked the confirmation code and tucked the device into her bag. The clinical efficiency of her movements was the final insult. She was already treating him like a closed file. The car is waiting downstairs for me, she said, her voice regaining that melodic, detached tone she used for strangers. The NDAs are in effect. Sebastian will release the statement about your medical leave at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. I suggest you spend the next few hours deciding which of your personal items you'd like to keep. The penthouse goes on the market on Monday. Julian didn't move. He sat in his leather chair, staring at the empty space where his life used to be. Where will you go? To a life where I am the architect, not the assistant, she replied. She walked over to the marble island in the kitchen and slowly, deliberately twisted the heavy platinum wedding band off her finger. It made a sharp, metallic clink as she set it down on the cold stone surface. It sat there, a perfect circle of broken promises, reflecting the dim light of the fireplace. She walked to the door, her heels clicking a rhythmic funeral march against the floor. At the threshold, she paused, looking back one last time. The penthouse was silent. the hum of the city outside sounding like a distant, indifferent ghost. Julian looked aged, diminished, a man who had built a world of glass, only to realize he was the only thing inside it that could break. "You know, Julian," she said softly, "you once told me that the view from the top is only worth it if you own everything you see. I looked out these windows tonight and realized I didn't want to own any of it. I just wanted to leave." The door closed with a soft, expensive thud. The lock engaged a digital click that sounded like a gavel. Julian stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below him, Los Angeles was a shimmering carpet of gold and neon, a city built on the very ambition that had destroyed him. He looked at his reflection in the glass, but the man looking back was a stranger. He had the title, the suits, and the legacy, but the soul was gone. He was the king of the ivory tower, and his kingdom was a vacuum. He walked back to the kitchen and picked up the bottle of 1982 Petrus. It was warm now. He poured the remaining wine into the sink, watching the dark, expensive liquid swirl down the drain until there was nothing left but a stain. He looked at the wedding ring on the counter. He reached out to touch it, but his hand stopped. He didn't deserve to hold it anymore. The sun began to creep over the horizon, a pale, sickly gray light that bled into the room. It was 6 a.m. In 2 hours, the world would know he was nothing. In 12 hours, Leo would be in Switzerland, far away from the wreckage. Julian leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window and closed his eyes. "I didn't just break our vows, Julian. I deleted you." Her final words echoed in the hollow chambers of his mind. He was alone. The penthouse was quiet. The empire was gone. And for the first time in 15 years, Julian St. James had nothing left to manage but his own silence.
Vivian walked away with her freedom, and Julian stayed behind with his glass towers, both of them forever changed by the secrets they kept. It's a chilling reminder that the cost of betrayal is often more than just money. It's the loss of the person you used to be. What do you think? Was Vivian right to take everything, or did Julian deserve a second chance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and share it. Thank you for listening, and remember to cherish the ones beside you. See you in the next story.